All right, welcome back, everybody, to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. In a previous segment, we talked about seniors who had not started even thinking about their essay, and we walked them through some ideas and suggestions for how to get started. But what if you are really just completely unengaged in the process, period, and it goes beyond just, oh, I haven't had time to write the essay, or I am afraid to start the essay, to a place where it's really just more like, I'm just not sure that I am ready to apply to college, or to go to college, probably more importantly, next year. Or if you're a parent listening to this, what if this is what you're experiencing with your child? So we wanted to talk about gap years in that context. And joining me is my colleague, Zaragoza Guerra, who is a former admissions officer at MIT, at Caltech, and at Boston Conservatory. An interesting combo of schools there, Z. And who I think is really well equipped to talk to us about this because he has worked with a number of students who have ultimately chosen gap years. So welcome to the show, Z.
Thank you, Beth. Glad to be here.
So let's talk a little bit about gap years. And I think that my first question for you, or would love to get your thoughts on, is, who's a good candidate for a gap year? And perhaps even expanding that to what even is a gap year?
Great. Well, I think, a gap year is something that is probably a little bit more customary abroad in other
Mhm.
places like the UK. And it's something that people have been more recently considering here in the US, at least to a greater extent. And it's certainly a part of a tradition here in the US. I remember when working as an admission officer, there were plenty of students who would request a gap year after they had been admitted. From our university, any one of the universities that I worked for. So it's certainly that something that can be done here in the US. And I think most colleges and universities are amenable to gap years and probably even promote them. And I
Mhm.
think, for students who are considering it, there are a number of reasons for pursuing it. It could either be someone who wants to pursue something professionally before they immerse themselves into an academic topic. They want to probably get a feel for their prospective profession, to see if that's something that they want to study in college. It could be that particular student who is doing it for practical reasons. There are practical things that they want to get under their belt, whether it's I want to learn another language, or I want to develop a particular talent. I want to spend that year growing in some capacity, and it might not necessarily be absolutely academically oriented. And then there are those students who just feel, I
Yeah,
need some
like our
growth.
student who hasn't started their essay, right?
Exactly. I
Yeah.
mean, this has been a tough year and a half, 2 years.
Hmm.
So if you're that kind of student who's at that point and who can recognize that you kind of need a break,
Hmm.
you kind of need to re-energize yourself. Hey, I applaud you. Go ahead and do it, and consider it, because we all need those breaks every
Right.
now and then, and that moment to recreate ourselves, and do something completely different. And I'm mindful of the fact that once you enter college, and then there are going to be plenty of students who are uh, going to enter a profession soon after that, or going to enter
Right.
graduate school, and life catches you by surprise. And all of a sudden, you wake up and you realize, ooh,
All of a sudden you wake up and you're 50
you're 50, and I
and
haven't taken any breaks. I haven't done
right.
that hiking trip throughout Europe that I wanted to do. I haven't done X, Y, or Z. So
Yeah.
this might be a really good opportunity to do that,
Yep.
especially after this past year and a
Right,
half.
right. And actually, what's interesting is I do think that this past year and a half, one thing it probably brought to the forefront for some people was this idea of that you could take a gap year, right? So deferrals became a hot thing because people were sort of like, I don't really want to go to school if I can't physically be there. Totally
Mhm.
understood. And I do agree that I think a lot of schools are fine with a gap year, but if it is something that you are seriously thinking about, and you're going to apply to college before you take your gap year, that is probably a good question to ask. You don't have to ask it as the applicant, like you could call up and be anonymous and say, "Hey, what's your policy on deferrals?" I know that here in in Massachusetts, the University of Massachusetts has a policy that they don't do deferrals. So if you apply, get accepted, and then decide you're going to take the year off, you have to reapply that, at some point. So it is good to investigate if you have some schools in mind. Obviously, the other thing you could do is just wait and apply during your gap year. And then you're not worried because you're not asking for a deferral.
Absolutely. Even in other places where the gap year is a little bit more traditional, I'll give an example. Sometimes I did international admissions, and there are some places where military service is
Yeah.
required, or some kind of community service is required before you enter college. And so those particular students from those particular communities applying to school here in the U.S. would be applying from their gap year. And I'd have to say, there was a lot of maturity that
Yeah.
came with those applications and experiences that were differentiating for those students. So there's something to be said how it could be perhaps a positive even within the admissions process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I mentioned earlier that you have worked with a number of students who have taken gap years, and I was just curious if you had some examples that you could maybe share with, I like the buckets that you put it in, the practical student, the professionally oriented student, those kind of just knowing, wow, I need to take a break before I'm going to be ready to go to college. Actually, I'm working with a student right now who's done exactly that. So I would love to, if you could have some examples that our readers could hear about and see, oh,
Sure,
that sounds interesting.
sure. Some of the students who I've worked with, there are two that come to mind who graduated a little bit earlier than usual,
Right.
and they took those gap years for practical purposes, sometimes a little bit of professional reasons as well, in terms of how they use that gap year. But I think one of the practical reasons for them taking it was to be able to go to school with their own age cohort, and for
Yeah.
them that was important. They felt they needed a little bit more, not necessarily maturity, but the chance to experience things that they weren't able to experience
Right.
as high school students. And so for those particular students, I remember one, he actually spent a bit of time in both practically speaking and professionally speaking. He
Hmm.
took on a couple of jobs. He was a programmer and had a lot of experience programming and a lot of know-how in computer science, and he asked a number of local companies if he could program for them, and that's exactly what he did.
Yeah. Cool.
On the side, he took a lot of classes at Coursera,
Hmm.
brushing up his skill sets with respect to machine learning and all kinds of computer programming languages that helped him with his particular job. On the growing up side, he decided to try things that he hadn't experienced. He took flying lessons, and
Hmm.
he started a music group that would enliven the lives of those in retirement communities in his particular area. So he did quite a number of things. He actually took 2 gap years
Yeah.
because he graduated at the age of 14. So there was a lot of opportunities for him to grow. I had another student who, um, there's a lot of learning that can take place
Hmm.
in a gap year that doesn't have to be done within the classroom per se. And it's not
Right.
necessarily it can be academic, but it doesn't necessarily have to be classroom defined. So I've had several students who've gone ahead and immersed themselves in research lab. They contacted professors in the local areas, and instead of just spending a month doing research like a lot of students might do, they spent a full year.
Yeah.
And that enabled them to present at conferences and to sometimes even start their own businesses.
Right.
These were really great experiences. On the practical side, I've had some students, in my own experience, growing up, and my first encounter with a gap year was one of my best friends who I met at my study abroad experience. She had actually done a study abroad experience before her
Huh.
official
Right.
college study abroad experience, and went to Brazil to learn the language and immerse herself in that culture. So, there are a lot of really exciting ways to do it. Personally speaking, while I didn't take a gap year, outside of high school. I did kind of take one right after college, and
Hmm.
uh, there was a nonprofit that I had contacted and had been working with, and I said, "Hey, can you take a volunteer for a year or two?"
Right.
And they took me on, and I was able to do that and just do something relatively fun.
Right.
Okay, they decided to pay me a little bit at volunteer prices, but it was a really great experience before I, entered my the professional world, so to speak.
Right. And she's not here to share her story today, but Sally, one of my co-hosts, who all of our listeners should know really well, did a gap year, and she chose the study abroad option. So she did that before she went off to college. One thing that I did want to note is, your student who took Coursera courses, right? Not for credit, your students who were doing academic things, but not in a classroom. Key there is that if you do take classes, you have to be careful because you could turn yourself into a transfer student, right? There are a number of schools where one course at the local community college means that you no longer qualify to be a freshman. So you do have to be really careful in your gap year that you're not doing something that will impact your standing when it comes time to go to college. So,
Exactly. And that's probably why academically you do some non-traditional things.
yeah,
I've even had some students who asked about semester at sea, and there's always that question, well, are you going to get college credit for that?
right.
How will a college or university feel about that? You're going to want to ask
Yes.
beforehand.
Right. And because nothing is ever simple, the reality is there are some schools that will be like, no problem, you'll come in as a freshman, and other schools where they will consider that as academic. So, and you'll
Mhm,
be in as a transfer. What
mhm.
about, so we've painted this picture and it does sound like there are some really interesting things that you can do. What are some resources that you recommend for students who maybe know that they'd like to take a break, but really have no idea where to start looking for that next thing to do?
Yeah, one of the places that I might recommend is the Gap Year Association. It's a nonprofit website that lists a lot of gap year experiences.
Mhm.
This is a group of educators who want to make it easier for students across the country to pursue gap years. Even regardless to cost. So that might be a really great place to start. And
Mhm.
they're a repository of a lot of gap year experiences out there. Even just looking at their website today, came across all sorts of gap year opportunities. I would say, sometimes some gap year experiences might be a little bit more expensive than others. Some might
Mhm.
require
Yep.
fees to a certain degree. I don't think that should necessarily deter one from a gap year because some of the students who I've seen do gap years have done so creatively and they've sought out experiences within their own neighborhoods, within their own region, within their own city. So my general recommendation is to ask all the adults in your life, ask your teachers, ask your school counselor, ask if you're involved in any nonprofit organization doing some volunteer work, ask them, be creative, because while they might not necessarily have an opportunity at hand for you, they might know someone else who does.
Right.
And this could be for those who are seeking out a volunteer opportunity, or
Mhm.
it could be for those who might be looking for a professional experience. To be quite honest, all the students who I've seen do a gap year for professional reasons, it's not as if they traveled across the country to take on a formal
Right.
internship. They sought out local mom and pop organizations just starting out who could use their help.
Right.
So definitely ask around, particularly locally. And as I said, um, for some students, college is not only a great opportunity, it's also a time where one might be taking out some student loans.
Mhm.
Okay, so think about that. After you graduate from college, you're going to be responsible for paying some of these back. So a gap year later on, or some of these experiences might have to be deferred for a while. So
Right.
this might be a really great time to do it.
Yep.
And there are economical ways to pursue a gap year experience. It
Yeah, and
doesn't you don't have to shell out a ton of money to do it.
very true. And I also think that to your point about, you're going to have to pay back student loans, you're also going to be starting your career in theory, right? So if you're in the middle of your career, it's really hard to take a break 5 years in and say, hey, I'm just going to take a year and go do something for fun. That's a little difficult to, I mean, people definitely do it, but it can be difficult to explain when you're coming back and now you want to get back into the work world. Now you've lost a year and maybe that's fine. You know, there are
Mhm.
arguments for and against that piece of it too. But you may come up against a hiring manager who says, well, you just took a year after being on this great trajectory. What happens when you're on our trajectory? Are you then in 3 years going to say, okay, I need a year off and I'm leaving, right? So more reasons I think that you want to think about the gap year sooner than later. And, you know, hey, maybe you literally just work for the
Mhm.
year and maybe it's not a fancy job and but you sock that money away and maybe that means there are fewer loans that you need to take out also and that could ease
Absolutely.
things up a little bit, right? So,
And it's not only that, it could be, you know, this is not necessarily a gap year experience. I'm just thinking about, you know, even those small breaks and that when you take on a job that might be a little bit unusual.
mhm.
And, you know,
Yes.
there are some experiences where you can spend your gap year even just doing, you know, working at a coffee shop,
Mhm.
doing a little bit of manual labor. I've once worked on a cotton gin on a farm, you know,
Right?
and those were very memorable experiences for me. I got to meet people who I otherwise never would have met and got
Right.
to experience some things that I never would have been able to do and learn some skill sets that I never used again. I learned how to manage a tractor. Don't do it in my current job, but hey, it was fun.
Don't do it in
So
your personal life
yeah,
either, but yeah,
exactly.
exactly.
Think of those creative experiences that you might not necessarily be able to do again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, we shared some real examples of people that, you know, students you've worked with. Any other, you know, again, people might be thinking, gosh, I don't know what to do. Any thoughts of, you know, some ideas that might get them started?
Yeah, I would probably say, you know, some real world examples of some opportunities that you might see out there. Some are going to be a little bit more expensive than others, but I think there are quite a variety of opportunities out there. There are students who might be able to volunteer for, you know, any kind of organization. I'm bringing up Habitat for Humanity, for example. Why
Hmm.
not spend that year giving of your time for them, making a difference within your community? That could be an opportunity. There are certainly some students who've taken a gap year to replenish their artistic skills.
Hmm.
Okay, and there's certainly a lot of great organizations out there like Idlewild, which
Hmm.
is an arts school that will have that has opportunities for students to, you know, become better at those artistic skill sets, whether that's the visual arts, whether that's the performing arts. There are students who, you know, could immerse themselves in their local community theater, for
Hmm.
heaven's sakes, if that's something that they wanted to do. If they wanted to, you know, one of the things that I think about are those students who love music, but you know, they know that's not something that they're going to pursue professionally, but they absolutely love it. Before they immerse themselves into their particular major, they could spend a year immersing themselves in that craft, in
Hmm.
piano, in voice, and so forth, and really spend the time that a conservatory student would spend
Right.
studying those things. It could be that it is volunteer work, you know, within their community. I mentioned Habitat for Humanity, but they're going to be political organizations that they could get involved with. You know, let's say they've got that idea to go into political science, volunteering for a political campaign. There
Hmm.
are lots of really neat opportunities. And then there are going to be some of those more well-known ones that people have already heard of, like Semester at Sea, you know, traveling, hiking. I remember spending a little time hiking across Europe and meeting a lot of students who were spending their gap year doing that,
Hmm. Yeah.
hiking, spending a year just going on these particular trails. And I wish, ooh, I got the opportunity to do that between jobs. I wish I had done that full time after high
Yeah.
school. That would have been an amazing experience.
Yes, exactly. Um, all right. Well, Z, thank you so much for joining us today. I think really good ideas and thoughts about gap years. I guess the last thing I would ask, and I would let our listeners know that we have in the past talked about gap years, and one thing that Z and I are not talking about today is using a gap year to improve your application so that you will be a better applicant. And that's a whole conversation, I think, for another day. What are your, just off the top of your head, really quickly, your thoughts on applying now as a senior versus waiting until you are in the middle of your gap year? Do you have a hard and fast rule on that?
I don't necessarily have a hard and fast rule, but I think it is a lot easier to
Hmm.
apply when one is still in high school because you
Yes.
still have access to all of those counseling resources
Yep.
at your fingertips, every day. It becomes a little bit harder when you leave. And the other thing that I will say is that I think sometimes we imagine that there's going to be a huge amount of growth that takes place in the gap year. And while that is true, there's not that much time in between when you would have received an admissions decision and when you need to apply.
Right,
That
exactly.
that growth takes a full year,
Yeah.
and you will have applied well before that full year will have completed. So
Yep.
if you're thinking of doing it for those particular reasons, I might say, hey, maybe two gap years.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I totally agree. Z, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Glad to be here. Take
Uh,
care.
all right. Next week, Sally is hosting. She is going to be covering the financial aid impact of having multiple children in college at the same time. Um, the benefits to that are shifting a little bit, and they're going to be talking about that next week. We're also going to be sharing stories from our team. So, one of our newest educators is going to be joining to share her personal story around college admissions. We're also going to be talking about what your regular decision college list should look like. Um, don't forget, if you enjoy this podcast, if you find that it's useful, please leave a review for us on Apple Podcasts. The more reviews we get, the easier it is for others to find us and also get our insight and our help. And if you have questions, send them to us. We're on Facebook and on Instagram, at College Coach BH on Instagram. I'm also on Instagram. Don't post as much as I should, but at Elizabeth Heaton 92. If you send questions to us via Facebook and Instagram, we will answer them on the show. You can also just email them to us, gettingin.voiceamerica@gmail.com. Again, it's gettingin.voiceamerica@gmail.com. And don't forget, we are here every Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern and 1 p.m. Pacific.